Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Separate negotiations with Russia and Ukraine this week were at the heart of the discussion about ending the war. We see that the sides are still very far apart, but it might not matter if the U.S. goes ahead and makes a deal with Russia over the heads of Ukraine and the EU. This is the biggest fear that came out in a leaked conversation this week between President Zelensky and other European leaders. Meanwhile, the U.S. released Trump's national security strategy, which upends the transatlantic relationship. We'll discuss this soon with our guests, but first, these reports from Ukraine this week. 5 hours. That's how long Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump's representatives spoke in Moscow about the 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. Both sides of the negotiating table have been tight-lipped about the details of the talk. President Trump described the meeting as reasonably good, stressing that it took two to tango. Putin, on the other hand, in a Thursday interview with India Today, called the discussion useful and necessary, attributing the lengthiness of the talks to a close revision of each point of the peace plan. The Russian leader said parts of the U.S. plan were unacceptable, and that Russia would continue capturing Ukrainian land militarily and by other means. The German weekly Der Spiegel has published excerpts from a Monday telephone call between the president of Ukraine and several European leaders, suggesting that Washington may betray Kyiv. The magazine said it was publishing direct quotations from Emmanuel Macron, who argued that, quote, there is a chance that the U.S. will betray Ukraine on territory without clarity on security guarantees, end quote. During a meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels on Wednesday, Secretary General Mark Rutte strongly welcomed the ongoing Ukraine peace process, but also said that the alliance was not going anywhere, stressing the need to continue exerting pressure on Russia. He added that NATO would speed up an initiative that allowed NATO countries and non-NATO Australia and New Zealand to buy American weapons for Ukraine. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski pointed out that the talks on the future of Ukraine should take into account the security interests of the countries on NATO's eastern flank. He also stressed the need to effectively deter Russia and continue assistance to Ukraine. While Ukrainian troops are slowly but steadily retreating from Pokrovsk, its sister city Mirnohrad has found itself nearly entirely encircled. While the southern and eastern flanks of the city are reportedly held by Ukrainian brigades, Russian infiltrators have proven that they are not impervious. Ever since the first Russian troops set foot in Pokrovsk in October, no Ukrainian vehicles have been able to pass through the remaining land corridor to Mirnohrad, with all supplies being delivered by drones and unmanned ground vehicles. The Russian noose around the city is tightening. Russian forces abducted at least 2 Ukrainian children and transferred them to a camp in North Korea, according to testimony delivered by Ukraine's Regional Center for Human Rights before a U.S. congressional subcommittee on Wednesday. The children in question are 12-year-old Misha from occupied Donetsk region and 16-year-old Liza from occupied Simferopol. Sent to Songdo-won camp in North Korea, 9,000 kilometers from their homes, the children were schooled in destroying Japanese militarists. Ukraine's watchdog said that the children had also met with Korean veterans. Ukraine says that more than 19,500 children have been illegally deported or forcibly displaced to Russia and Belarus. And now joining us is Doug Klain, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Deputy Director for Policy and Strategy at the Razom for Ukraine, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization supporting Ukraine. Hello, Doug, and so great to have you on. Thanks for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yes. Now let's start off with diplomacy and the U.S. strategy to negotiate an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. Is it a wise decision to send a special envoy and the president's son-in-law, who have no experience in security and foreign policy, to negotiate a deal over the heads of Ukraine and Europe?
Well, I can't say whether or not it's a wise decision, but I can say that throughout this year, we have seen that Steve Witkoff's lack of experience in diplomacy has had real impacts on this process. We saw quite often he would go into meetings with Vladimir Putin without a translator from the U.S. Embassy, relying on his own notes. And at times that has led to mistakes, frankly, like a misunderstanding of what Putin was ready to concede, which resulted in a whole summit being hosted in Alaska. No real results came of that summit. And of course, now we seem to be in another process where the U.S. believes that the Russians might be willing to make a deal, believes that Ukraine might be politically weak enough domestically that it could be pushed into some kind of a quick agreement. And now we're seeing in the last few weeks, the U.S. and Ukraine are trying to iron out some kind of a new framework, but there is still no indication that Vladimir Putin wants to make peace. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Why isn't Marco Rubio more visible in these discussions and negotiations? I mean, we see him on the Ukrainian side speak with the Ukrainian delegation, but we don't really see him at the table there in Moscow. Is this breaking with the norm? I mean, shouldn't the Secretary of State be leading America's foreign policy for the president?
It is breaking with the norm, and it's something that has alarmed quite a lot of Republicans in Congress here in Washington. When we had these reports of Steve Witkoff's, tapes that, recordings of him coaching Kremlin officials on how to get what they want from President Trump, we actually had congressional Republicans calling for Secretary Rubio to be allowed to do his job and lead this process. Now, of course, President Trump is standing by Steve Witkoff throughout it. After he was asked about Witkoff coaching the Russians, he said that's a normal thing to happen in these negotiations. We're just trying to get to a deal. And of course, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has now been added into this. They are the ones leading these talks with the Russians. And Rubio is not. It is not a normal thing. But we do see, I think, that Witkoff and Kushner really are much more in the president's inner circle. They are trusted by Donald Trump. He is, relying on them to give him more of a read of what the Russians want. And they, of course, have existing relationships. There's been quite a lot of reporting on Steve Witkoff's business ties to many of these interlocutors, including to Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian special envoy for this, and the Kremlin's former financial director.
Now, seeing what we've seen this week, do you believe that there's a risk that the United States will make a deal with Russia and force it on Ukraine and its European allies?
Well, so I think that we saw an attempt perhaps to do that with that 28-point peace proposal that came out a couple of weeks ago now. That elicited quite a lot of backlash here in Washington. There was significant pushback from Republicans in Congress. Some of them threatened even to resign over it. And that pushback, I think, was key to giving Ukraine some of the space that it needed to try to renegotiate that framework with the United States. What we haven't seen so far, though, is a political will in Washington to actually start passing legislation to sanction the Russians, to support Ukraine again. There were threats to do that. There are still ongoing talks, actually, in the U.S. Congress on whether to try to force a vote on some kind of Russia sanctions. But so far, there has been no real forward progress on that. And I don't think we're likely to see congressional action to sanction the Russians or support Ukraine, certainly not for the rest of this year.
Well, we've seen, with this, we're going to get to this in just a moment, but we've seen the no NATO expansion as part of Trump's policy moving forward. We've also seen another development here lately that indicates a very pro-Russian stance, if you will, that the United States is moving much more towards the Russian side and forcing more of the Ukrainian side to consider things it would never consider, such as territorial concessions, potentially no NATO membership. What are we supposed to think of all of this? Is this just what we're hearing right now, or is this deeply embedded in what we're going to see moving forward?
Now, these are really fundamental questions, I think, about what the U.S. stance is now when it comes to NATO enlargement and welcoming Ukraine into the alliance. That is a consistent position that the administration has had throughout this year. Viewers might remember earlier this year, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, now they call him the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, went to a NATO meeting and announced that Ukraine would not be accepted into the alliance and that the United States would block that, was taking it off the table in an attempt to try to negotiate a peace deal with the Russians, making concessions unilaterally in exchange for really nothing, for the hope that maybe the Russians will stop fighting. We've seen the Russians instead keep pushing for more and more. But we've also seen, this big news today in Washington. The long-awaited national security strategy has come out from the Trump administration. This is something that they have been working on for months. It has been long awaited, and it is really a statement of intent for what we can expect from the next few years of the Trump administration. And it envisions a very different role for the United States and a very different relationship with Europe. Really, it is something that I think a lot of European policymakers should be quite alarmed by. When it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to NATO, it's very clear that it wants to end the enlargement of the alliance. This is something they've talked about quite a lot with the Russians. The document itself wants to end the perception even of an ever enlarging NATO. That's something that the Russians quite often say that they don't like and that they want an end to. They want to see, in fact, the alliance rolled back. And so this is something where the Trump administration does appear to be going along with that. It also envisions not the United States coming to Europe's defense, not coming to Ukraine's defense when it comes to Russia's invasion, but trying to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine through a diplomatic settlement and to restore normalized relations with Russia for stability in Europe. And it envisions the United States as a diplomatic go-between between Europe and Russia, not as much as an ally of Europe against Russian aggression. And that is, I think, cause for alarm.
Absolutely. Definitely. People are very alarmed here in Europe. We also had this leaked conversation between President Zelensky and European leaders. What insights does this give us? Is this telling as to how Europe is starting to perceive the transatlantic relationship? And really, what choices does it have?
Well, in the context of, will the Trump administration try to impose a bad deal on Ukraine and Europe? I think that is one of these risks that we're seeing. The Trump administration is certainly trying to get a deal done over the heads of other European leaders. And that is something that clearly is alarming. Many of them, including German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron, as you referenced in that call. The big question, though, is will the rest of Europe, I think, give Ukraine the support that it needs to reject a bad deal? At its core, what Ukraine wants is an end to this war, but it needs an end to the war that ensures it's not just going to restart a few years down the line in a way where Ukraine is left worse off and unable to confidently rebuild and defend itself and deter future aggression. And so, if the Trump administration tries to impose some deal where Ukraine is left in a gray zone, in a diplomatic no man's land, with no real security guarantees, with restrictions on its military, these are things I think that are a clear red line for Ukraine. And the question is, can it get enough support to reject that kind of a bad deal? We already saw in that 28-point plan plenty of commitments the United States was trying to make on Europe's behalf without consulting Europe. Things like, of course, stationing European jets in Poland, of trying to commit the hundreds of billions in frozen Russian assets that are in Europe to plans that would benefit the United States and giving some of them back to Russia. Those are, I think, clear issues that European leaders do not want to go along with. And we've seen in recent days, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is trying to get Belgium to release its lock on those frozen Russian assets to make sure they do, in fact, benefit Ukraine and not just go back to Russia to fund the next war.
And it was reported that Steve Witkoff has been actively trying to influence that decision-making process, trying to get Belgium not to release those funds so that Ukraine could borrow them for reconstruction or even active defense. Then we see these talks that took place in Moscow. The U.S. Treasury Department, for instance, on Thursday extended the authorization for Lukoil-branded gas stations outside of Russia to continue operating, suspending some of the sanctions on the Russian energy giant. So does this give the U.S. a weaker hand in negotiations or a stronger hand? I mean, we've just kind of highlighted three main points where the U.S. has come Russia's way. Will the U.S. get anything in return for this in this negotiation process?
So we've now seen the second waiver on these sanctions on Lukoil. Now, after the first waiver was done, I think there was not as much alarm in Washington over that. It's not abnormal for sanctions to have a grace period for some of these assets to be sold off. And the U.S. actually tried to block an original buyer for those Lukoil assets. Again, though, with these sanctions still being waived, I think this is starting to cause some concern in Washington. Of course, if the Trump administration actually wanted to pressure the Russians to put economic pressure on Moscow to try to force it to make a deal to end the invasion, then it would want there to be sanctions going in, causing real damage against the Russian economy. Continuing to waive those sanctions does not cause that and undermines U.S. efforts to try to pressure Russia into a peace deal. You mentioned some of this reporting with Steve Witkoff, and there have been, I think, very concerning reports in the Wall Street Journal in recent weeks about some of these business overtures that the Russians are making to American businesses to come back in on energy deals, for companies like Exxon to rejoin a gas pipeline, for associates in Trump world to buy even the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and try to revive that project, something that was sanctioned by Congress and, of course, was bombed and destroyed, reportedly by Ukrainian special forces. This is something I think really does indicate there is significant a conflict of interest, really, throughout this process. There are business officials that want to try to restore ties with Russia to get sanctions off. And of course, the thing that's standing in the way of that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Russians want to keep going and keep fighting and try to win on the battlefield. And all of this is really giving them the opportunity to drag out talks, to string the United States along and try to get a better position on the battlefield.
Are there some parallels we can draw with Trump's kind of revamping of the Monroe Doctrine in this document that he released earlier, I believe it was today, saying that the United States should focus on its sphere of influence? And does that indeed justify or say or admit that there is a Russian sphere of influence and maybe that's where Ukraine belongs?
So the document itself, I would agree with the prior guest that this is something that really does acknowledge spheres of influence. It sees the Western Hemisphere and this side of the Atlantic as the U.S. sphere of influence. It proposes what it calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, the original Monroe Doctrine was this policy that European powers should not get footholds in the Americas, that should be the United States' sphere of influence. And this Trump corollary to it is that hostile foreign powers should not be able to have this sphere of influence or foothold in the Americas, and that the United States will prioritize its own security by strengthening its borders, by engaging in, if necessary, lethal force against drug cartels and trying to undermine other powers that are trying to compete on this side of the world. When it comes to Europe, this document, the National Security Strategy, it really does call out these things that it proposes, like the Great Replacement Theory happening in Europe, this idea that non-white citizens are coming and replacing white citizens in Europe, and that this is this way of de-Europeanizing Europe. It's something that it proposes that the United States should try to support what it calls patriotic political parties that are trying to restore traditional values in Europe. And it calls into question Europe's own commitment to its security and to the NATO alliance. It's a really stunning document, and it proposes more involvement really in European domestic politics, something that we got a bit of a sneak preview of earlier this year when J.D. Vance and members of the Trump administration were trying to support the AfD party in Germany during their elections. That's something that I think, if it keeps following this national security strategy, we're going to see more of.
Do you think the Trump administration explicitly wants to see the end of the European Union, per se?
Well, the document doesn't say that, but it does call out the European Union as something that undermines the sovereignty of European states. And it wants European states to stand on their own, working together, but without this influence of international organizations such as the EU, which it calls out explicitly, that it says is holding Europe back and undermining the culture and the innovation and prosperity of European states. The Trump administration really is identifying the EU as what it sees as the problem. But there are contradictory things that it includes here. It says that it wants Europe's defense industry to be revitalized so that Europe can take ownership of its own security. At the same time, it's complaining that Europe is investing in its own defense industry rather than buying American weapons, because, of course, European countries are questioning the reliability of the United States at this moment. Just a couple weeks ago, the United States threatened to withhold weapons that it had pledged to sell to European countries for Ukraine, and that European countries had already paid for, in fact. It was trying to use those European payments for weapons as leverage to try to force Ukraine to accept that original 28-point proposal for ending the war. And so I think that moves like that really do undermine what the administration says it wants.
And it also begs the question of whether Europe can do this on its own. In your opinion, do you think that Europe, if the political will is there, can the continent support Ukraine to continue to resist Russian aggression, even without the United States present? And it does seem like that weapons would be the major bottleneck and something that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to overcome.
There are key capabilities that the United States provides to Ukraine that at this time cannot be exactly matched by European countries. And these are certain things like strategic air defenses, these Patriot air defenses that the United States has helped to provide to Ukraine, as well as certain kinds of intelligence support. But Ukraine itself is innovating and others are catching up. Ukraine, of course, is coming up with its own indigenous air defenses, including new interceptor drones that are cost effective to try to defend itself. And Europe is trying to replace some of these capabilities to fill the gap if the United States fully steps out. I think the key question really is political will in Europe. We see that really playing out in a very active fight over the fate of these Russian assets. Europe has money. It has the ability to help Ukraine, but it needs the political will to take action, to build, to innovate, and to rapidly fill these gaps.
And before we go, I'd like to get your opinion on this attempted attack on Zelensky's airplane when it landed in Ireland. Apparently, 4 military-grade drones flew. The flight path, as President Zelensky landed, thanks to the fact that he arrived earlier. Some say that they avoided disaster. Do you think that Russia would try and assassinate President Zelensky in such a grandiose way?
Yes, I think the Russians would absolutely try to do that. Vladimir Putin has spent years delegitimizing Ukraine's government. Just now, he is saying that he can't make a deal with Ukraine because its leadership is illegitimate. It's part of this long-running conspiracy that the Russians have propagated that Ukraine has been taken over by Nazis in a coup in 2014 rather than a democratic, people-led revolution of dignity that the Ukrainians had. And I think that the Russians do see Zelensky as an obstacle here. They want to try to sow political chaos in Ukraine, to fragment the country, to leave it more vulnerable to external pressure and aggression. And so if the Russians were to do that, I think that's absolutely something they would do. These drone incursions are happening more and more throughout Europe. And they are getting increasingly brazen. It's a threat that Europe needs to figure out how to defend against. We, of course, saw difficulties in European countries defending against drones that have come into their airspace or having to use very costly air defenses or missiles to shoot them down. Ukrainians have learned that that is not the right way to defend against these military-grade drones. And they are innovating and developing their own interceptor drones, like I mentioned, to cost-effectively shoot down Russia's Shahed-type suicide drones. And so that is a huge threat that Europe needs to figure out how to defend against now.
Very well said. Doug Klain, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week. Thank you so much for your analysis. We really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us and hope to see you then. Goodbye.